Hello, hello. I must confess, like most nights these days, I did not sleep well last night. I'm hoping that ends soon. And I think I've been kept awake in many ways by just intense ideation, cognition, what some people would call getting downloads, but that requires inferential structure that isn't necessarily the case. I've had a busy mind. Since early December, I've written about 200,000 words. And I think my last big idea came to me earlier this week. And I kind of hope it's the last big idea for a while because I need time to integrate all of this stuff. So that seems to be indicated in my next phase that begins in a couple of weeks. So I share with you my saga of insomnia just to ask for some compassion for my quote-unquote performance today, because I feel both incapable of recording a podcast, but at the same time compelled to. So I'm going to go with doing it anyway. So if I'm slow to find words and sound a little tired, it's because that's true. But not quite the show must go on, but I must follow what it is I feel I'm supposed to do. That being said, got some cool things for you today. I'm gonna work with a piece about self-authority. Someone recently asked me, what is the point of self-authority? And I wrote some stuff about that. I can't remember if it's actually in the piece I'm going to work with today or not, but I'll address that probably. But it made me realize that the subject of self-authority needed some more attention and some granularity and resolution. I don't mean resolution in the sense of completion, but resolution in terms of zooming in, focus, higher res, that kind of resolution. Also, I want to tease you on the subject of self-authority, as is a new tradition, not the right word, possible format, possible persistent format. I have a chart to share with you today, a mystery chart, a blind chart to follow on the structure before story. And I'm going to show it visually this time, which will be fun. I even have the name blocked out with a question mark on it. It's very high-tech graphics because, of course, that's what I'm known for, as my high-tech graphics, right? So we'll do that, I guess, at the end. And it's very much in the domain of self-authority. So there's a thematic connection. How about that, right? This is really high-budget stuff. So let's jump into the self-authority thing. A distinction must be made between two forms of self-authority that are often conflated, but are both structurally and experientially different. The first is what we could call forceful self-authority, and the second is what I would call aligned self-authority. Both involve action, direction, and the capacity to move one's life forward. And from the outside, they can appear similar, but from the inside, they're not. The forceful self-authority is typically the first form that emerges when an individual begins to move out of passivity. It is often experienced as a necessary correction. Decisions are made deliberately, sometimes against resistance. There's a push to them. The individual asserts direction, holds position, and pushes through competing impulses. That's key. There's like a sense of moving parts, inner moving parts, and possibly outer as well. There's a sense of effort and will being applied to produce movement. This form of authority is associated with discipline, decisiveness, and strength. And that term discipline there is important. When people use the word self-discipline, I always wince a little bit because it's one part forcing another part to do something. Not necessarily always, but if you sort of intuit between the lines, certainly when someone says, I just got to make myself do it. Well, the question would be, why do you need to make yourself? What's going on there? And this is frequently reinforced culturally, and people see it as a form of leadership, but it's largely control. And structurally, forceful self-authority operates through internal opposition. It's will applied against friction within the system. The individual is not moving because all parts are aligned. They move because one part of the system overrides others. This may involve suppressing uncertainty, ignoring emotional signals, or subordinating competing considerations in order to maintain direction. The result is effective action, perhaps, but at a cost. And over time, this mode produces fatigue, rigidity, and a tendency toward over-control. Functional, but not efficient. And of course, functional according to what standards? So this is what identity targeted as leading with will. But what I would say is it was not nuanced enough a model. So now let me speak to the other side. Aligned self-authority. So identity would say, well, self-authority happens when you're not leading with will. Identity conflated aligned self-authority and willful and forced self-authority. Didn't make the distinction. Because it would say that we're emotional beings first, so any kind of leading with will is automatically inauthentic. I don't agree anymore. I certainly did for a while. So we're unconflating that now, disambiguating. So aligned self-authority emerges later, usually, when the internal structure of the system has reorganized. In this mode, action does not arise from the imposition of will against resistance, but from a reduction in internal contradiction, less moving parts. The individual no longer experiences the same degree of competing impulses requiring resolution. Decisions are not constructed through effortful deliberation in the same way. The subjective experience of this is described as or felt as a loss of decision making. When you experience this, you may feel as if you're no longer choosing, that events are unfolding, or that you're being carried by something larger than you. And this description, while phenomenologically, I have a hard time with that word, phenomenologically, yeah, that's it. Phenomenologically, you got to make metaphysics fun, otherwise it can get dry. So this description, while phenomenal, I can only do it once per day, I think. Phenomenal, I can write it. Phenomenologically, I can't do it. I did it once. I proved that I could do it once. This description, while phenomenal, that's the insomnia talking. At the level of phenomenon, I'll walk around it. It's accurate. But it can be misleading if this is taken literally. So the problem is when people feel carried by something, and this shows up with flow states, and it can be sort of inferentially assumed that, oh, well, you're leading with love, or you're in the flow, or you're in harmony with the universe, so your individual agency is no longer operational because you don't feel that forced will. You don't feel authority as one part working against another part. Okay? But just because your expression of will doesn't create friction internally doesn't mean it's not an expression of will. Okay? In forceful self-authority, there's an overriding of some kind, whatever that is. Could be lots of things. But in aligned self-authority, there's less identity, there's less friction, So it can seem like will is not operating. And that's a trap to assume that, oh, the loss of will is actually the secret to being in flow. That's what I would call a category error. That's what philosophy would call a category error. And in identity terms, it can be used as a truth in service to subordinate self-authority to someone else's authority. More on that later. So where was I? The subjective experience of this shift, phenomenological. I did it. Phenomenologically, I did it again. I just need to practice. So the subjective phenomenological experience of this shift is described as a loss of decision making. The individual may report that they, I just read that same paragraph again. I guess I need to do it again. Sorry. So I was in the middle. This description, while phenomenologically accurate, I get 5 points every time I get that word right. It can be misleading if taken literally. Agency has not disappeared. It has changed form. In forceful self-authority, the individual experiences choice as an act of construction. They weigh options, consider consequences, and exert effort to determine a course of action. In aligned self-authority, the process occurs earlier, more subtly, with less effort. The system registers what is structurally appropriate with sufficient clarity such that the action appears obvious. Everyone's experienced this. Even if you don't experience it very often, you've experienced this. The individual acts, but the sense of having manufactured the decision is diminished. What remains is recognition followed by movement. This shift can be described succinctly. In forceful authority, the sequence is, I choose, therefore I act. In aligned authority, the sequence is, I see, therefore I act. The act of seeing, the act of recognition, carries the authority. It's prior than the efforting. And what's important is, it's will either way. It's just less healthy will versus healthier will, aligned versus less aligned. The experiential qualities of these two modes differ accordingly. Forceful authority tends to be tense, effortful, and mentally active. It often involves internal dialogue, justification, and a need to reinforce one's position. Aligned authority is quieter, more subtle, less forceful, obviously, more easeful, more efficient. It's characterized by a sense of simplicity and directness. There is less internal noise and less need to explain or defend the action being taken. That's important. There's this great acronym you may have heard me say before. You don't JADE, J-A-D-E, justify, argue, defend, explain. Forceful authority has to justify, argue, defend, and explain. Aligned authority doesn't need to do that because it's not pushing against anything. The individual is not negotiating with themselves or someone else to the same degree. The relationship to uncertainty also changes. Forceful self-authority attempts to resolve uncertainty prior to action. That's important. Let me read that again. Forceful self-authority attempts to resolve uncertainty prior to action. It seeks sufficient information, certainty, or confidence before committing to a course. Aligned self-authority operates differently. It does not require the elimination of uncertainty. It acts when there is sufficient clarity, not absolute clarity, and adjusts as conditions evolve. This does not mean recklessness. It reflects a different threshold for action, one based on alignment rather than certainty. Similarly, the relationship to outcome shifts. In forceful authority, action is often tied to the achievement of a result or the validation of a decision. Success confirms the correctness of the choice. Failure, whatever that means, what you intended to happen not happening, is how most people define failure, can destabilize the individual as it challenges the decision-making process itself. In aligned authority, action is oriented toward what is structurally appropriate in the moment. Outcomes still matter, but they are not the primary source of validation. The individual can adjust without the same degree of fragmentation when results differ from expectations. In other words, you learn to operate without control, without the illusion of control. It's important to recognize that forceful self-authority is not an error. It's not bad, it's not wrong, it's certainly not evil. It's a developmental phase. It represents a necessary movement out of passivity and dependence. It teaches the individual how to act, how to hold a position, and how to generate movement where there was previously none. This is why teenagers use a lot of forceful authority. They go from having basically no self-authority as children, and the teenage phase of self-authority where they're discovering their independence and their self-authority, their identity, all of that is wrapped up in teenage years. They don't just jump from no authority to aligned authority. They experiment and they move through this phase. Without that phase, the transition to aligned authority is unlikely to occur. It's a transitional structure, forceful self-authority. And in teenagehood, whether that's, between 13 and 20, or in terms of consciousness, when people stay teenagers at the level of consciousness, you learn what doesn't work about forceful self-authority through feedback, right? That's the teenage phase. I mean, it lasts forever in one way, but teenagers generally are very much in school about the consequences of their actions. And that's how you parent a teenager. You give your teenager increasing options and you help them realize what the consequences of their actions are. That's how you move from forceful self-authority to aligned self-authority, one of the ways. Okay, aligned self-authority depends on the reduction of internal contradiction. Right, that makes sense. Because if there's internal contradiction, then you have to force yourself to do something. The reduction occurs through alignment. When the functions of the system are operating in appropriate domains, and when timing is respected, the need for internal opposition diminishes. You have less moving parts. The system is no longer having to override itself in order to act. As a result, action becomes less effortful and more continuous. Now, here's an interesting sort of sidebar. You see this a lot. It's a baby in a bathwater thing or a pendulum kind of thing. So we all know what forceful self-authority feels like. And I think we intuitively and emotionally don't like it, right? Because when you exert forceful self-authority, you're working against, it's one part working against another part of you. And that takes effort and it creates friction, and friction is tiring. So how do we relate then to that? And what is it that we want? Well, if you really feel that acutely and you're structured in such a way that you're sensitive and really feel that friction a lot, you might start to fantasize about a way in which you're operating where there's no friction whatsoever, where things are just easeful and harmonious and, utopian level, dream-like easefulness. And that's the trap. Because to the degree you're experiencing internal friction that is increasingly intolerable, is going to be the degree to which some exhausted protector part might be wishing for the end of friction. And then, if a teacher comes along and says, hey, it's possible to live in total harmony with everything or everyone, a oneness state, or a some ultimate state of consciousness that promises never-ending ease, well, now you're going to be vulnerable to subscribing to that's possible. A permanent state of consciousness of such ease, bliss, for example, or oneness, or whatever the version is. There's a lot of versions of it. Instead of looking at it as alignment is an ongoing orientation where you can reduce the internal friction inside yourself, but there's no permanent state of non-individuated, no moving parts, no will. You're just moved by love or harmony or God or whatever, and your individuality has been somehow subsumed either by soul or by God or the non-dual or whatever, such that internal friction is forever gone. That's the seduction. That's why we're drawn to that kind of thing. And more on this when we get to the mystery chart of the day, because it shows the structure of someone who takes advantage of exactly those kinds of, it's a wound. It's a wound in us that is so troubled by our suffering that we over-idealize and over-seek a permanent kind of ending of that suffering in whatever way. Just like it's the same dynamic as when you're really hungry, you order too much food, right? That's why you're not supposed to go to the grocery store when you're hungry. It's just a simple human overcorrection. Okay, let me go back to the text. I'll read a bit more, I think. I don't know. I'll trust that I'll know when I'm done with this. I don't know if I'm going to get to the end of this piece. This is okay. The experience of being carried or of life unfolding is a byproduct of the reduction in friction. When the individual is no longer resisting the direction in which the system is already organized to move, action feels smoother and more inevitable. This should not be mistaken for passivity or enlightenment or God realization, or those things I think have reality to them, but the idea that the individual has somehow been transcended in whatever way, or the individual's will has been replaced with love, no, I don't think so. The individual is still discerning, selecting, and acting. What has changed is the absence of unnecessary interference. So a precise formulation can be offered. Forceful self-authority is will applied against internal friction. Forceful self-authority is will applied against internal friction. Aligned self-authority is action that emerges when internal friction has been reduced, not eliminated. I would not claim that that's possible. It can be asymptotically reduced through alignment. So the experiential correlate follows directly. One feels as if they are no longer making decisions, a good amount of the time perhaps, because the system is no longer divided against itself. So it's a relative kind of state. Less moving parts. It can feel, and I'm sure everyone listening has felt this, it can feel that's the flow state. But it's not that you're not making decisions. It's just that the internal friction is reduced so much it relatively seems so. The parts that previously required negotiation are sufficiently coordinated that action can proceed without conflict. So the distinction has practical implications. Many individuals, in attempting to develop self-authority, focus on increasing will, discipline, or decisiveness, and these capacities definitely have value, but they do not address the underlying source of friction. Without alignment, increased will just intensifies the application of force within an already divided system. It can produce short-term results, and it's certainly handy sometimes, but it doesn't resolve the structural issue. A more effective approach is to reduce the conditions that produce the internal contradiction. This involves identifying where the functions are misapplied, where domains are incorrectly engaged, and where timing is ignored. This is the basis of the work that I'm doing with people now, It's about alignment. As alignment increases, the need for force decreases. Authority becomes less about pushing and more about moving with what is already structurally appropriate. That is healthier will. In this way, self-authority is not something that is achieved through effort alone. It is something that emerges when the system is organized such that effort is no longer required to overcome itself. So what appears from the outside is better understood as recognition. The individual does not encounter an idea and gradually come to understand it through effort, interpretation, or persuasion. Instead, something in the material lands with immediate clarity. The response is not, I need to think about this, but rather something like, I've always known this, but I did not have the language for it. And this is a critical distinction that marks the difference between information being introduced into a system versus structure being activated within it. I'm just looking ahead to see. I think this is a good place to stop. So it goes on, but I think this is a good place to stop. And so this answers it answers the question in one way of what is the point of self-authority? Why do we need that? The simplest answer is that healthy self-authority, aligned self-authority, gives you ease. And if you don't have aligned self-authority, you have internal friction that your will has to fight against. One part fighting against another. That creates friction. That creates waste. That uses up resources. And that creates suffering. Life is hard, right? So do you want to be a quote unquote machine with moving parts that are competing against each other? Or do you want all of your, to use a car metaphor, all of your valves aligned in the engine of who and what you are so that they're all working together? It's like you ever see someone running and their arms, instead of going forward, back along the plane that they're going, their arms are going left and right? That's unaligned, right? That left-right movement is pulling you left and right. It's not where you're going. I was never a very good runner, but I was a good swimmer. And even more common in swimming, like in freestyle, we had a phrase called crossing the line. And if you imagine a midline, going right down like the center of your body, where your nose is, nose, belly button, all the way down to between your feet. When you reach where your hands go in freestyle, aka crawl, because freestyle can mean you can do whatever you want. It's just that crawl is the fastest. But in what is called freestyle, if your hand goes past the midline, then you pull yourself, if your right hand goes past the midline, then you pull yourself a little to the left. And then to straighten out, your left hand is going to cross the midline and pull yourself back to the right. So good swimming means your hand goes right in where the line is. You want to reach far and grab as much water as you can. But if you ever watch people swim, that's, I'd say, for people who are not trained competitive swimmers, 50% of people cross that line. And they're swimming inefficiently. They're working against themselves. You can, like I said, you can see it in running as well. You can see this in walking. You can see people when their feet, often overweight people, just because it changes the architecture of how they're walking. They start sort of walking side to side, sort of a little bit of a waddle. Inefficient. So I'm not picking on overweight people per se. This is just a metaphor. There's a psyche level structure version of this that has to do with the 7 lines of development. You want to be aligned in will, mind, structure, emotion, relationality, body, and I left one out. Let's back up. Can I get all 7? I get 5 points if I can remember all 7. Will, mind, structure, those are the more yang ones, and emotion, intuition, relationality, and body. Those are all 7. So there's alignment in each of those and misalignment. And then there's also alignment. There's intra-alignment within each category. There's also inter-alignment. Is mind going against emotion? Is will going against emotion? Is intuition going with or against mind? And a lot of different possibilities there, combinations. So that's the focus of my work now, is looking for where is there misalignment, which is structurally represented very well by an astrological chart if you know how to use it, manifested in suffering in the person's life, and ameliorated, solved, made better by finding that friction and tuning up the engine. What does that look like? Depends on the line. Emotional line looks different than the mental line. Structural line looks different than the body line. It depends. But the astrological chart saves a whole lot of time fishing around looking for what a structure needs what kind of attention. And that's what I'm continuing to fall in love with. So with that as a, segue, let's look at the blind chart today, which very much has to do with authority. So this is the first time I've shown you an actual chart, visual aid, if you're on YouTube or in Substack, whatever, it's looking at the video. So this is a wheel. I learned on North Indian charts, and I love North Indian charts. They're great, a lot simpler in many ways than what is typically thought of as a Western chart, or the wheel chart. But this is not a Western calculation. That's why I showed you in the upper left. This is the Lahiri Ayanamsha whole sign chart. Don't get me started on the astrological software world. It is such a mess. Most of it looks like the programs were designed by 14-year-olds in the late 90s. This is from AstroGold. It's a program for the Mac, and it makes the interface was the nicest, and the charts are the clearest, so I decided to go with that. But I use North Indian charts on other software sometimes as well. Learning the glyphs was annoying. I still sometimes make mistakes with that, but that's the main hurdle there. Does show the aspects pretty well. Okay, so first house. This is a Sagittarius rising. That's what that little red arrow means. So key elements here: Sagittarius rising. Then we have Mars in the second. Then we have Saturn conjunct K2 in the fifth. This is Jupiter in fourth, but that's not as important. This is really important. Saturn conjunct K2, and both of those are in retrograde. By the way, that's why they're in red in fifth. Then we have Moon in Cancer at a relatively young degree, just 6 degrees in the 8th house. That's important. Moon in 8th house. I don't know if I said K2 and Saturn were in the 5th house in Aries. In some cases, I won't go into more detail than is necessary because it just bloats the presentation. But, you can talk for 10 hours about a single chart, of course, but I'm trying to keep it tight. And then in the 11th house, we have Sun conjunct Rahu. Rahu is retrograde just like K2 is because they're at the same degree. Relatively young degree. They're just at 5 degrees. In the 11th house in Libra. And then in the 12th house, we have Venus in Scorpio at just 2 degrees. That's definitely early. And Mercury at 9 degrees in Scorpio, also in 12. Okay. So Sagittarius rising means the system meets reality through meaning. It wants to interpret, teach, frame, and organize experience into a worldview. That's the existential orientation of a Sagittarius rising. So the first question is, what happens when a person is built to orient others around meaning? That person could be a teacher, a philosopher, a guide. It doesn't have to be a spiritual teacher or an academic teacher. It could be a river rafting guide. It could be anything, but that's going to organize them in that direction. It's someone who, whether they actually do it or not, structurally, it's someone who wants to organize reality for others. The woman who cuts my hair is a Sagittarius rising. She doesn't have a job that is a teacher, but she is constantly giving me advice that I don't ask for, right? So it's there. It's just an orientation toward reality, and it's so existential, it doesn't occur to her that I'm there for a haircut, not advice. I don't have to ask for advice or for her opinion about life or about me or whatever. I've sometimes had to set boundaries with it. That's an example of that. So there's a structural orientation toward that. Okay, so now let's look at, on top of that, the sun with Rahu in the 11th house. I'm showing you with my cursor as best I can here. So the sun is identity and centrality, self-authority in some ways. And Rahu amplifies whatever it touches. And the 11th house is in the collective field, groups, networks, systems of people. So identity is not just present, it's amplified. And it's also amplified through groups. You follow that? So the sun is amplified because of the 11th house, systems of people, networks of people, and it's amplified even more so by Rahu. And also Rahu is in a young degree here. 5 is definitely considered on the young side. It's not as intense as, say, 2 degrees. But when a planet is early in a sign like that, it's less contained. It's raw. It usually will it will lack boundaries, especially with Rahu, which demands containment to be able to manage well. It's going to be more on the raw side. More amplification, less containment. Okay, so what happens when identity expands through a collective? One possibility is leadership at scale, influence. Another is a system where a person becomes central to a group's organization, right? So we're combining this with the Sagittarius ascendant. The Sagittarius ascendant. So someone who already wants to orient other people in terms of meaning, and then also has Sun and Rahu, their very identity, amplified in relationship to groups. So now let's move to Moon, which is over here in the 8th house. Moon in 8th house is always a really fascinating placement. Moon tells us how the system stabilizes. So this moon is in Cancer. This is the Pushya nakshatra. That's 6 degrees on the early side. Pushya, the nakshatra, remember in Vedic astrology, the personality is significantly dictated by the moon nakshatra, not the sun, as in Western. Pushya stabilizes through care, nourishment, and containment. It creates safety. It feeds, protects, and holds. It's a Cancer nakshatra. Right? Cancer is very emotionally protective. But the moon here is in the 8th house, which is a domain of instability, loss of control, and intensity. The 8th house in my system is irreversible transformation and the loss of control. It's being transformed. So now we have a very specific structure. We have a system that regulates by creating safety, but in an environment that is inherently destabilizing. So what happens when someone often offers care, because this is an other-oriented chart, Sagittarius ascendant, and the very strong 11th house, which I don't remember if I mentioned is in Libra, which makes it even more other-oriented, calibrating, related to, this is a Libra sun and a Cancer moon. So there's a Libra, don't automatically think in terms of other when you think of Libra, but think calibration. But the 11th house is an other house. It's networks of people. So it's Libra and 11th is calibration in relationship to social networks. So what happens in such a case like this? It could be someone who is a healer. It could be someone who is a protector. It says this organization, the structure says, I can take care of you in a place where you cannot take care of yourself. That's how I interpret this structure. Now that's a powerful dynamic. Now let's add Saturn and Ketu in the 5th house here in Aries. The 5th house governs expression, creativity, projection, and also the field of students and followers, because it's self-expression in the face of risk. And it's 6 houses away from the 11th house. There's a dyad here. 5th house and 11th house are a dyad. You can think of all of these as dyads. 3-9, 2-8. They're kind of oppositional. And 5 and 11 are particularly interesting because the 5th house of creative expression, expressing into what? Into networks of people, depending. And so in this case, with a very strong outward-facing 11th house, and we've got planets in both, we've got a total of 4 planets in these 2 houses, there's a very direct link between that self-expression is going to affect networks of people because there's representation in both of them. So what is Saturn doing here? Saturn constrains. It puts pressure on, and it's an early degree. It's only at 3 degrees, so it's going to lack containment. Saturn is necessary boundedness. When it's functioning properly, it creates boundaries. So it would boundary the self-expression in appropriate ways. But in Aries, it's going to lack some meta, especially at 3 degrees. Aries is immediacy. Aries is without self-reference. It's like a match being struck. It just goes for it. So that's, when we're talking about self-expression, Saturn and Aries in 5th would indicate the boundaries on the self-expression are going to be probably less than well contained. They're definitely going to be challenged. And on top of that, we have Ketu conjunct. That's Saturn. Ketu fragments and detaches. So it's going to weaken Saturn's boundaries here. So what happens in a group when a leader's structure is maybe not so strong? Their individual self-expression lacks boundaries. And it's suppressing, could be suppressing their individual expression. You can interpret it that way. It could also, because Saturn sits on things, right? It's heavy. It inhibits until something is right. That's what healthy boundaries do. It tests. But it also, you can also interpret this as someone who is suppressing individual expression in general. This structure could suppress individual expression in other people, especially with this very strong other side of the dyad, the 11th house, outwardly facing, where there's identity in relationship to groups. If this person is getting amplified identity needs met via calibrating with groups, and their boundaries in their own self-expression are not so strong, you can start to see there's a dynamic here where it could be, right? That's all structure. How could that play out? Well, it could be that other people's individual expression is suppressed for this person's benefit. Okay? That would reduce autonomy, encourage conformity, and you would get dependence on the central figure, which is a structure here in the 11th house where there's wanting to be the sun and Rahu would create a structure where it would be easy to fall into for this person wanting to be the center of a group. Okay, we're almost done here. Now let's layer in Venus in Scorpio in the 12th at just 2 degrees, also young. So it's going to be weak boundaried, weak containment, lacking metacognition. That's just structurally how it goes. Venus is attraction and valuation. The 12th house dissolves boundaries. Scorpio intensifies, and in the 12th house will create merging. So attraction here, Venus, operates through intensity, Scorpio, and boundary dissolution, 12th house. So what happens when people are drawn in through intensity and then lose clear boundaries? Well, you get entanglement. You get difficulty separating. You could get deep attachment. Finally, let's look at Mars in the 2nd house, 27 degrees. Now, that's a late degree. This chart has a fair amount of early and late degrees. I would say definitely more than average. Some people's charts don't have any early or late degrees. And 27 is not acutely late, but definitely in the neighborhood. So Mars is mobilization and expression of force. The 2nd house is continuity, sustenance, what sustains the system. So add those together, and it's, and by the way, Mars is in Capricorn, which is exalted. So that's strong. Mars likes Capricorn. It gives it, it's like a nozzle on a hose. Capricorn offers the structure that Mars needs for the force. Like another metaphor is like a long barrel on a rifle. Do you know, this is an interesting fact about rifles. The longer the barrel, the more force the bullet generates, because the gas behind that bullet is propelling it longer through that barrel. And then as soon as the bullet leaves the barrel, the gas pressure is no longer propelling it. That's why longer barreled guns are more powerful. So the structure of Capricorn here is exalting Mars, making it even stronger by giving it that shape. And it's also strengthened, sort of, you would say in astrology, exhausted, overdone, because it's at 27 degrees. So it's an overactive Mars, you would say. Exalted doesn't mean good; it means very active, and it could be in an aligned way or an unaligned way. But if someone doesn't do their shadow work, it's going to be predictably in some amount of unaligned way. Okay, so this means force is used to maintain continuity, 2nd house, and there's plenty of it here. Force is what sustains the system. So we have a system, summarizing here. Organizes reality through meaning, Sagittarius ascendant. Becomes central and amplified through a group, Sun and Rahu in 11th. We point to that. Stabilizes others through care, Moon in Cancer, inside destabilizing environments, 8th house. Restricts individual and self-expression. One or the other, maybe both, we don't know. 5th house, Saturn and Ketu. Draws people in through intensity and dissolving boundaries. That's our Venus in 12th house, Scorpio. And uses force to maintain continuity. Mars in Capricorn in 2. What kind of environment would this create? Well, this could be a legitimate teacher working with intensity and care both. Could be a very powerful person, because it certainly has a lot of elements stacked here to produce someone who would be in a leadership position. Another possibility is a system where individuals become destabilized. The central figure becomes the source of stability, 11th house. Boundaries dissolve relationally, 12th house. Dependence formed, also 12th house. And individuality is constrained. So this is a very specific structure. Any guesses as to who it is? So this is the whole point of the exercise, is to see that the structure happens before the story. Structure before story, that's the name of the game. This could be a lot of different people. And now the very high-tech reveal. I'm going to move the black box I made, if I can do it right. There it is. This is Adi Da, also known as Dafri John. I forget his real name. I used to know it. Something pretty ordinary. Not Richard Albert. That's Albert. That's Ram Dass. Not Stephen Gray. That's Ajashanti. Franklin Jones. Ah, yes, Franklin Jones. What a plain name for such a powerful individual. Became Dafri John, then Adi Da. Was well known for sleeping with about a half a dozen of his students at any given time. Literally stated on a number of occasions that being in his presence was necessary for his students' enlightenment, and held forth in a quite dominating way for an enlightened teacher who supposedly had no self. He took up a lot of space with that self. So his Saturn and Ketu fifth house somehow became in enlightenment. I don't doubt his awakening. The moon in eighth house would point to potential in that domain. And I didn't talk about Jupiter in Pisces, but that would also point to potentiality in that domain. It's a strong chart, and Sagittarius orientation as an ascendant with these, with the eighth house moon. It certainly is a structurally strong orientation toward a spiritual seeker prior to becoming a teacher. But Adi Da was a well-known abuser of his power, and he held a lot of power. And so there were for sure some cultic dynamics operating there. And so this is maybe a topic for a future episode, because I find this topic fascinating, but I'll say a little bit about it right now. What I've looked at a number of leaders' charts, famous cult leaders, like Adi Da is one, what's his name? David Koresh. A lot of these people's charts are available online. And what you start to see is there's a set of ingredients that they all have in common. Moon in eighth is really common. Regulation through, in this case, we have regulation through care, but also instability. So it's regulation in an unstable domain. So for Adi Da, it's not hard to interpret that his Pushya protective Cancer nakshatra, he was taking care of people by destabilizing them. Now, in a pure Zen perspective, you'd say, or any kind of deconstructive work, you'd say, well, destabilization is just part of the game. Real work requires destabilization. Yes, that's true. But what his chart says is he's emotionally regulating himself through destabilization. Now, that's a failure mode if it's not well organized. I may have said this in the last podcast. I was looking at one of the Columbine shooters' charts. He also had a moon in, I believe it was Pisces in the eighth house. That's self-regulation in the domain of instability, with Pisces dissolving boundaries. So, yeah, I think I did talk about this before. So moon in eighth house it's intense. And if it's not well managed, then the failure mode can be extreme. I want to say Steve Jobs has a moon in eighth house. I can't remember though. So it's not that it means something bad is going to happen. It just means when it does go off the rails, there are strong consequences because the eighth house is so intense. And you have a developmental tension there because moon is regulation and the eighth house is about the opposite. So there's a strong developmental tension there, and that's a general chart principle. When you have a function, a planet, operating in a house that is opposite that function, it creates developmental tension where there's a lot of focus and a strong consequences for mismanagement, let's say. High risk. Okay, so not only is he regulating via instability, but then you have this identity calibrated to networks of people with Rahu as an amplifier for that. So this says, I can never get enough. That's the failure mode of Rahu. I can never get enough identity in relationship to groups of people. So that's the second part of what you see in cult dynamics in the leaders. You see some kind of eighth house involvement, often some kind of regulation via instability. They like instability. They get something from that. Then you see some sort of gaining identity through other people. And then you see some kind of very strong confidence. In this case, we have the Sagittarius rising is starting with that. Mars in second is doing a lot of that work because the second house is responsible for our self-worth. So a late degree Mars in Capricorn turns that up. And we didn't talk about the effect of Jupiter in Pisces in 4. That's expansion of the inner self. So this is a strong inner base, inner foundation in Pisces, which dissolves boundaries. So notice how many elements, really all of them, combine to, it's like if you were to build a chart for someone who would participate in cultic dynamics, they all fit, they all contribute. And that's what you see, fascinatingly, in these very big personalities who make a big dent in the world. Is he a powerful teacher? For sure. Did he do a lot of good? Oh, absolutely. But the big gifts, big shadow, they just go together, right? And that's unfortunately what happens when you awaken and don't do your inner work. Well, then your shadow is going to be operating to some significant degree. So in the manuscript I released in whenever that was, late February, the yin as essence fallacy, there's a line I dropped in there that I wondered if anyone would notice, that I will highlight for a moment before we close. And that is, given how well a structurally decoded astrological chart can reveal the psychological structures, as in this case, that would cause someone to use other people for their own identity, sun, and internal regulation, moon, then what I would suggest is if you have a teacher, coach, therapist, or any other kind of helper, you should demand to see their chart. Why wouldn't you? Because whatever they say about not needing you, and I'm sure Adida, whether he said it explicitly or not, I'm sure he held, not only is there no him, he's just being the absolute, right? But I'm sure he held in groups, embodied, at least ostensibly, that he didn't need his followers. But what does his chart say? His chart says his internal state and his very identity is dependent on groups of people looking at him and thinking he's the man. That's what the chart says. And the chart don't lie. So I've made my chart not exactly public, but I did share it in the one of the second Sundays, which, by the way, I've discontinued for various reasons. And if I've shared my chart with people, if you guys if anyone wants to see my chart, I'd be happy to share that. I might even do an episode about it. You know what I mean? Like, just in the name of transparency. I already have a failure mode of self-referencing too much, so I try to avoid talking about myself unless it's relevant. But I'd be happy to show that, because my chart not only doesn't show that I gain from people in this structural way that Adida did, it actually shows an aversion to entangling with people, which is something I've worked on, actually, the other side. So I'm not wired for these kind of cultic dynamics. That doesn't mean I'm perfect. That doesn't mean that I operate in total health and relating of all kinds. Of course not. We're just talking about the level of structure. So what I would say is, we're talking about free will. There's the structure of the person's psyche that is then modified by free will. But what I would assert is, let's say someone wanted to become a cult leader or even just a leader. If their chart doesn't support that significantly, it's not going to happen. You can't just become who and whatever you want. That's what children believe. That's what parents tell their 8-year-olds to inspire them. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's just an error related to free will. So I'm not saying Adida was destined to become a cult leader, but he had the proclivity, just like a genetic predisposition toward becoming an alcoholic. If you have that gene, then you might want to be careful with alcohol. Did you know, by the way, that tobacco, nicotine, is not uniformly addictive? I think it was in Malcolm Gladwell book I read once. Nicotine is only physically addictive for about 50% of the population. And I've gone in and out of nicotine a number of times in my life. I've never been addicted to it. I just don't have it. That's not something special about me. It's just a structural truth, right? So given that this is the case, and if you're listening to this podcast, you are probably someone who has used helpers of different kinds, therapists, coaches, teachers, whatever, in the past, and maybe will in the future. I'm telling you, you want to see their chart. And if you don't know yet how to interpret it, well, I can help you with that. GPT or any other, I was going to say any other AI, no. All I can say is that Claude and GPT can be good at astrology if you give them decent parameters. I mean, they're pretty good out of the box, but you have to ask the right questions. Gemini, I would not trust with astrology. It's not as good. Not all AI are equal. Some of them are more oriented toward critical thinking than others, structural thinking. Okay. Thanks for listening. Until next time, bye for now.